All right, welcome everyone. Great to have all of you guys here. I will actually not talk so much specifically about Prospéra, but actually talk a little bit more about why does Prospéra need to exist at all, right? What is the problem with the current system? And then when we understand the problems with the current systems in a good way, then we can talk about, okay, what are the solutions and why can Prospéra be one such good solution, right? But this is a more zoomed out philosophical talk with some specifics as well. Right, so specifically I talk about not the failures of all government, but of legacy government. And just brief on my background, was a previous AI entrepreneur from Sweden, have a company there, and I was about to move to San Francisco around 1.5 years ago. At some point I just got too dismayed by the state of government. I was Googling for free city in new jurisdiction, and Prospéra came up. And so I read more about it, I came over and visited, and it really aligned with me. And so I ended up resigning my US O1 visa, leaving my startup, and coming down here to lead growth. And this is roughly where we are now. This is where I live, and we are a few hundreds of people living here. Most of us come from either the Honduran mainland or from Europe or the US. And people always ask, why do you guys care to come to this island, right? Why do you bother? And the brief answer to that, of course, is that this is the only place, this small, 500 acres, it's the only place in modern history where you can actually, on a fundamental level, innovate on governance, right? Innovate on what it is for government, what it means for government to distribute services, right? Including the rules themselves, the laws and regulations, the justice system, security, and then taxes as well. And the reason why we care about governance is that the quality of governance is what determines the wealth of nations, right? More than anything else. And so if you look throughout history, the default state for humans is one of poverty, having their kids die before the age of 5, having essentially no luxury to take any time off, right? It was very hard work, and basically we didn't have economic growth. Of course, something happened, right? We had the Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke, Adam Smith, and others, and the US founding fathers, who were some of the first ones to actually implement the working new governance system. And this eventually, of course, led to the Industrial Revolution and the massive wealth creation we've seen ever since. And if this would have been left without too much government intervention, my thesis is that we would at this point live in a world with almost no poverty, abundant medicine, housing, energy, universal high income, right? Universal high income, and the government that actually works for the people. Unfortunately, we're not there yet, right? Current governance is broken. 2/3 of people are actively dissatisfied with their governments. Almost all of them are losing money unsustainably. And so what we'll do today, in this brief session, is to look at a few examples in the key industries and go to the root cause of why is government failing? Not like just that they're failing, but what are specific mechanisms that leads them to do so, and how can we do better? And so there are three big ones we try to identify, right? It's not evil necessarily. The main one is incentives, right? So if you have a business, you have a profit-loss incentive to improve. If you don't improve, you get competed out of the system. As a politician or an agency, you don't have that profit-loss incentive at all. And the main thing is just sounding good, right? There's also lack of competition, right? If you go in a market and you don't like option A, you can go to option B. In the regulatory world, if you don't like the FDA, you basically have to uproot your entire life and family and move somewhere else to live in another jurisdiction. So it's a massive monopoly lock-in. And the third problem is that there's no price signal, right? So Hayek spoke about the knowledge problem, right? Where even if you have functional incentives, even if you have competition, you still, as a central planner, you don't have the detailed price signal that individual actors in the market have. Okay, so let's look at the first example, which is housing. All right, so as many of you guys know, in big cities, housing can easily eat up 30, 40, or 50% of the paycheck, especially if you're a worker. And the reason is not that we're kind of forgotten how to build housing, or that we don't have enough space to build housing on. We have plenty. The reason is that we've outlawed building more housing, right? And we've outlawed it in many different ways, but the key way is zoning, where we basically have this long list of restrictions on if you have a house A, then you can't have a house of type B, C, D, E next to it, right? And so in isolation, these laws always look reasonable, but if you add them up, you get quite interesting results, right? So the New York Times actually recently made an investigation in New York, and they were looking at how does the New York zoning code look like. And they found that you can forget about building any new housing in New York because half of the current buildings are illegal, right? So the current zoning restrictions, basically New York could never have been built with today's regulations, but they were of course built in a previous time and a previous era. I'm from Sweden, so I can speak a little bit about Sweden. In Sweden, we have the longest waiting time in the world. We have these housing queues, and they are about 30 years now to get housing. And it takes 15 years to get a building permit, but that's common in many places. The key thing that Stockholm and Sweden does uniquely is that we have we have rent controls, right? Pricing caps. And the Swedish government, to their big credit, they actually made an investigation of what has this led to, right? And so they have this graph here where on the purple you can see what does it cost to rent out something in second hand, and this yellow one is how much this costs to rent out in first hand. And so what happens is that the first hand rentals are the only ones regulated, right? So you can only charge X amount for your first hand rental, and so what happens is that everyone just gets into the first hand rentals and then sublets it for double the cost. Right, and so what this is a wealth transfer from people actually building housing and having first-hand rentals to people who are then just subletting it second-hand. And so the clearing market price is the same, it's very high, but there's nobody building housing because you can only charge 50% of the actual value. Right, and this is what happens when you introduce price controls, but it's quite interesting to see in Sweden because the government is the one implementing it and then also researching it and finding out that it didn't work. But they still don't change it. So that's on housing. And so the core reasons are dysfunctional incentives. Of course, the politicians, they don't actually have clear incentives to improve this. There's lack of competition. There's one zoning board in New York. You can't go to a competing zoning board for your building. And there's no price signal either to the politicians. Now, this is a solved problem, right? So if you look at Stockholm and New York, you've had massive inflationary costs for housing in the last decades. In Tokyo, you have much more simple zoning laws, and you've had almost no increase in pricing, even though they've grown even more. Right, so this is a solved problem, but they're just that jurisdictions basically don't care to implement solutions. At Prospéra, we not only do we not have zoning on the jurisdictional layer, we try to go one step further by having a Georgist land value tax. Right, so whereas typical property taxes, it disincentivizes building more housing because the more housing you build, the more you're taxed on the property value. We only tax the unimproved land, right? So if you have an acre of land and I have an acre of land, and I just sit on it, I just hoard land, and you build housing and skyscrapers, we pay the same tax, right? So in effect, this incentivizes efficient use of land. Okay, anyways, next example, climate change, right? So climate change is a big problem. I think it will get worse. Unfortunately, to a large extent, it's caused by government intervention, right? So we've had clean energy now for many decades, in nuclear specifically. It's around, it's a few tens of thousands of times safer than that other energy sources we've settled with, like coal and oil. And this number of 0.03, it would be zero if you looked at nuclear reactors in the last 40 years. Right? So these days, nuclear reactors are basically fully safe. We're not using them. And some people are saying, okay, the reason we're not using them is that they're not competitive, right? It's cheaper to use other energy sources. And that is true, but it's true for the wrong reasons. Right? So I'm not sure how well you can see this graph here. Can you see it at all? Okay. Well, so it's a little bit technical, but I'll walk you through it, right? So on the y-axis, you can see the cost to produce nuclear in the US per kilowatt. And on the x-axis, you can see the total amount of nuclear energy produced. And so what you get is what they call a learning curve, where the more you produce of something, the more efficient it gets, right? The more iPhones you produce, the cheaper they get. And what you see is this exponential decrease in the cost for nuclear for many decades, several decades. And this is a log scale, right? So it's an exponential decrease. And then something happened here where it shot up. And we have a smart crowd here, so I guess I can ask, why do you guys think the cost shot up randomly? Did we forget about physics or any other reason? Regulation, yeah, this smart guy here. Well, it was the formation of the DOE, like the Department of Energy in the US. In Europe, we just outright banned nuclear fully. And this, of course, led to a massive price increase. And it led to us just using coal and oil. And, now we see a similar graph for solar, right? Similar with solar, the more you produce of solar, the more the price decreases. The same thing is, though, that almost all of the solar is in free market jurisdictions, whereas like Texas and Nevada, whereas California and New York and those places, they have no solar because of regulation, right? So the things plays out the same. Anyways, in nuclear, right, we have this new SMR, small medium-sized reactors, who are finally kind of getting started. We had one approval 2 years ago, so first approval in 4 decades, in 40 years. And again, since we have such a smart crowd, I want to ask, how much do you guys think it cost them to get the regulatory license to launch their small, medium-sized reactors? Not the science costs, but what did the regulatory application cost? Sorry? 7 figures. Someone else? $5 billion. Well, okay. Well, it's in between, right? It's $500 million. It cost $500 million. And the way and this is online, you can read about it. The way they came up with $500 million is that this agency, they charge you $300 per hour of reading your application, right? And this is relatively common, but what it leads to is that the agencies are incentivized to force you to give them enormous amounts of text, right? So in this case, it was 2 million pages that they submitted, right? So that's how you do the math, right? If you have 2 million pages, $300 per hour, you get $500 million. And so this, of course, screws up the ability to have reasonable clean energy. And so the massively dysfunctional incentives, politicians just care about what seems safe, right? Not what actually is safe. There's a lack of competition. These things are mostly regulated on the national regime, on the national level, and there's no price signal. And again, this is a solved problem. If you go to France, they get most of their energy in nuclear. There's nobody dying of that in France. South Korea also did very well for a long time. But these countries, they don't have the incentive to learn from others, so, they don't. Okay, medicine. Obviously, medicine is more than a miracle. We used to having half of our kids die before the age of 5. We used to have a third of people dying from infectious disease. And today, those problems are massively improved because of treatments that were developed by scientists and business people that were able to start a company, develop a drug, and then go to market. Unfortunately, that mechanism is no longer there. It's almost impossible for new companies to go to market in traditional jurisdictions, right? It costs enormous amounts of money to go through the US or European regulatory system. And there are many reasons for this, right? But to kind of graph it out, on this graph you can see the number of drugs you get per 1 billion of spend by time, right? And what you can see is we've had an exponential decrease in how many drugs we can get out of the door from $1 billion invested. And there are a few reasons for this, regulation being the main one, where regulation has skyrocketed in the last decades, especially in biotech, but also generally. And just to kind of contextualize this problem, right? Because generally this happens to the people who are losing out from new drugs are, I guess, what they could be called as invisible graveyard, right? People who are in graveyard, but invisibly so, because they could live if there was the right treatments available. One example, though, of a visible graveyard is the HIV epidemic in the early 90s, right, where we had tens of thousands of people that were dying of HIV, even though there were very promising treatments available, but they couldn't get access to them even on their deathbeds because they hadn't gone through the 10 to 12 year FDA regulatory cycle. Right, so they just died in that case. And there are a few reasons for this, right? We all want safe drugs. Nobody wants unsafe drugs. However, almost all of the costs to develop a drug is not focused on proving safety. It's focused on proving efficacy. And we all want efficacious drugs, but if you put the government regulatory machine into that, it balloons the costs. You also have the better than the Beatles problem, right? Where even if you start up, you raise money, you develop a drug, you prove that it's safe, you prove that it's effective, you still can't launch it generally, because you have to prove to regulators that it's also better than the current alternatives on the market. So it has to be better than the Beatles. It has to be better than the best. So the software analogy is, let's say you're going up against Airbnb or Facebook, and you develop an MVP and it's safe and it works. You still can't launch it if it's not provably better than Airbnb on the first iteration, essentially. And there's always details to this, but that's the overall situation. And there are a few reasons for this, right? All of these regulations are not necessarily bad for big pharma, right? If you're a big pharma company, you quite enjoy having a regulatory moat that makes it hard for startups to compete. And so, what we see empirically is that many of the FDA commissioners, at the end of their career, they just go and work at these big pharma companies, right? So it's a revolving door between them, which you can deduce from that what you want. And so the massive amount of these functional incentives, right? They have incentive to, they think about their future employers. There's lack of competition. There's again one regulatory body, and there's massive lack of price signal. I'll give you one last example. Criminal justice. So, criminal justice is interesting because if you've been to New York and San Francisco, you'll see that there's a massive amount of people who should be in jail that nobody's touching, right? There's that end of the problem. But then historically, if you look at the big picture, the main problem has not been a lack of impersonation, it's been an over-impersonation, if that's the word. Too much people in prison, I guess. So if you look at the prison population, it's almost 7x from the 70s, even though the population as a whole in the US only have increased by around 50%. So it went up massively, and then it dipped off a bit. And since we have, again, a smart audience here, I guess, does anyone have a guess as to what happened here with this graph? Why did it take off, and why did it start to dip down? War on drugs, yeah, you've been 3 out of 3, I think, yeah. So war on drugs, right? It was a bipartisan effort. 100% of people voted for it, shut up the prison population. And that's around the times when we started decriminalizing cannabis and marijuana and stuff like that. So again, hundreds of thousands of people who got their lives ruined for no reason whatsoever, right? And of course, some of these people are bad people. I'm not saying that all of them aren't, but I'm saying that hundreds of thousands of people have gotten their lives ruined for nothing. And if you look at federal prisoners, again, federal prisoners, most of them are nonviolent, and the majority of them are for what they call for drug offenses. And the causes of this is, of course, dysfunctional incentives. Politicians didn't care to understand the details, but they went with the slogan of the war on drugs, right? It's a nice slogan. And there's lack of competition, there's no price signal. Again, this is a solved problem. In Portugal, they decriminalized drugs, and they've had fewer deaths and much safer than other jurisdictions. Again, people don't really look at Portugal as an example of something that works because the fundamental incentive to improve. No, in this area, because the fundamental incentive to improve isn't there. Okay, now getting into Prospéra, wrapping up as well. So with Prospéra, what we're trying to do is that we have regulation as well, right? And regulation is a small part of governance. There's also justice system, there's security, there's a bunch of things. But looking at regulation specifically, what we're doing in Prospéra, right, is that we have regulation, right? If you're in construction, if you're in finance, if you're in health, we have regulation, but we've taken away the traditional model, right, which is like this, where you have your business and you have to go to one of these agencies which have bad incentives, like competition, etc. And generally what you end up with is massive waiting times and massive costs. And so that paradigm doesn't work for us, and so we have a new one, where you have your business and your regulation of choice. So in Prospéra, you have choice of law in regulated fields. So you can choose to work under Singapore law here, you can choose to work under Hong Kong law, you can choose to work under Delaware law, doesn't matter, you can work under those things here. Or if those don't work, you can propose an optimal regulation, so you can have some legal innovation from scratch, but that has to be approved by a council and experts. So you can have flexibility in the regulatory body, in the regulatory code, sorry. But then you have to go to a market of insurance providers to get you your business permit. right? So your business permit is essentially a regulatory insurance. So insurance companies will look at your business and your regulation of choice and your team and say, is this safe enough to underwrite and give a policy to? So obviously the insurance companies, they will not underwrite something that's dangerous. You know, if you try to get a home insurance in Florida, you'll know that the insurance companies care a lot about things going wrong. And so the insurance companies, they are not perfect regulators, but they internalize both the downside and the upside, right? And so they are more ideal in that way. And so to wrap up, right? So the three core fundamental errors we kind of identified with traditional legacy government is dysfunctional incentives, lack of competition, no price signal. And we at Prospéra, are by no means perfect, right? But the things we've been trying to design for in solving this is that, you know, on the incentives, by default, we are more aligned incentive-wise, and because we are more like a private governance provider, which means that we live or die by our ability to give enough quality so that we can earn tax revenue, right? So we're not looking to necessarily get elected. We're looking to provide value. And so that's a big shift in mindset. And there's more competition built in, right? We're not looking to take over existing cities. We're starting greenfield and build upwards from there. And so people who are aligned can elect to opt in, right? And even when you opt in, you have to contractually sign that you agree with the system. And there's even mechanisms where if you own land and, you know, let's say Prospéra goes corrupt in 20 years, there's a way to fork the jurisdiction or create a sub-jurisdiction within Prospéra, or, you know, go back to the Honduran regime. So there's a lot of competition built in at the core layer. And then in terms of the price signal, I would like to say that, okay, we're smarter than other planners, and so we can just plan better. But I don't think that is true. I think the way to solve the high X knowledge problem is by, again, making the government small and decentralizing the economic resources and the power down to individual businesses, right? And so that is the way to allow price signals to guide resource allocation in a better way. So yeah, that's the philosophical part. And, you know, so far it's working well. If you look at Prospéra versus Cayman, Delaware, it's easier to run. It's faster to open a business. It's cheaper to run it. Taxes are generally lower. Dispute resolution is more predictable. You have more regulatory flexibility. And yeah, I guess that's the high levels. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lonis.